Several years ago, when Unitarian Universalist minister, teacher, and theologian Tandeka set out to write a book about race, racial identities, and racism in white America, a book that would become the book Learning to be White, she found herself at the fork of two well-trodden paths, a place of decision that many of us who have considered race in America have also encountered. One option she faced was the road that has been carved by books, workshops, committees, and projects, special programs, workplace seminars about how to get along with them. And by them, we mean the blacks. People who travel this path ask the questions, what are we to do with, about, or for them? What do they want now? Why can't they take care of themselves? Meanwhile, the other road was lined with stall after stall, packed high with books and government reports. People who walk this path focus on the questions, how can we show them, the whites, what they are doing wrong? Why won't they give up some of their privileges? Why are they so rigid and uncaring about everyone except themselves? Neither of these roads felt right to Tandeka, for the more work she completed, the more research she conducted and observations she made, the more she realized that she was heading down an altogether different path, a way being blazed by a set of travelers who, if they were only left alone, could lead us all on a real journey toward wholeness. These trailblazers, these travelers, are not devout workers for anti-racism, nor are they pious religious leaders crying for salvation from the sins of humanity. These travelers are, simply put, all of America's children who have not yet been indoctrinated into pre-existing notions of race, particularly what it means to be white. These are the travelers not yet hindered by shame. These are the innocent travelers whose core sense of self remains untainted. These are the voices that she wanted to rediscover. Through interviews with several hundred Euro-Americans, an examination of history, and the perspectives of several prominent cultural spokespeople, as well as applications of developmental psychology, Tandeka considered the ways in which racial identity is learned, consciously or subconsciously, and came to three primary conclusions. The first, no one is born white in America. The second, the first racial victim of the white community is its own child. And three, racist acts are sometimes not motivated by white racist sentiment, but by feelings of personal shame. I'm going to share with you more about her conclusions this morning so that we might begin to consider together how all of us have been racialized, and by racialized, I mean impacted by our own indoctrination into the racial groupings in which we find ourselves. The foundation upon which Tandeka builds her work are the personal memories of Euro-Americans, how they first discovered that they were white, what that meant at the time, and how that early learning has continued to impact their lives, and in turn, the lives of others. She discovers that most of these memories are stories of small, seemingly inconsequential defeats, and yet, when those sharing the stories are encouraged to reflect on the legacy of these defeats, they rediscover the pervasive, though mostly subconscious notion that something about their white identity is not quite right. Small defeats, it seems, can lead to significant consequences. She started collecting these stories of white racial identity after an experience she had many years ago. She'd recently moved to a small New England town to teach at the local college. A few weeks into her time there, she was invited to lunch by a staff member, a woman she describes as a fifth-generation Smith College graduate with a New England genealogy older than the state and a portfolio perhaps as wealthy. Wanting to get to know her, the woman asked Tandeka what it feels like to be black. Tandeka writes, I was not offended by her query. Her face was open, her eyes were friendly and engaged. She simply believed that nothing from her own background or experience could help her understand me. I knew better. I had been assigned a race by America's pervasive socialization process, and so had she. I thus believed that if she drew upon her own experience of being raced, she might then be able to see what we had in common. But how could I make her conscious of the racialization process to which her own Euro-American community had subjected her. Attempting to answer this question, Tandeka invited the woman to participate for a week in an activity she labeled the race game. If the woman agreed to play the race game, she would have to follow only one rule. For the next 7 days, she would agree to use the ascriptive term white whenever she mentioned the name of one of her Euro-American cohorts. She would say, for example, my white husband Steve, or my white friend Mary, or my white daughter Megan. Tandeka guaranteed the woman that if she played the race game for a week and then met her again for lunch, they would be able to talk using terms they would both understand. Tandeka says she suggested the race game as a means to help her Euro-American lunch partner discover her own racial identity. While African Americans are familiar with using racial language to describe themselves and others, Euro-Americans have also learned a pervasive racial language. For Euro-Americans, however, their own racial identity has become the great unsaid. As one historian has noted, discussions of race in America usually mean talking about African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans. If whites come into the discussion, it is only because they have attitudes toward non-whites. Tandeka wanted to help the woman give voice to her whiteness as the racial unsaid in her life. By consciously referring to this unvoiced color, she would then become aware of what it feels like to take on and maintain a racial identity in America. Tandeka did not get to hear how it went. Apparently, the challenge had made the woman uncomfortable, and she never joined Tandeka for lunch again. As it turns out, the woman's unwillingness to play the race game would be the first in a pattern. Later that year, Tandeka says she recounted the lunchtime exchange to a faculty colleague who immediately blushed and quickly confessed, "Don't ask me to do that, I'm about to go on sabbatical." Intrigued and perplexed that the prospect of playing the race game seemed so daunting, Tandeka decided to describe the two responses she had received to the race game during her next public lecture and then invite the audience to collectively reflect upon them. During the ensuing public discussion, a woman in attendance challenged all of the other Euro-Americans present to play the race game just for the rest of the day and to report back to Tandeka by mail. Enthusiasm, Tandeka recalls, ran high. A month later, she received the only response she would get from the previously enthusiastic audience. The letter came from the Euro-American woman who had originally extended the challenge. She said that she had been unable to follow through, though she hoped one day to summon up the courage to do so. Tandeka found herself asking, courage? Why courage? What had I asked her to endure? What was she afraid of seeing? What didn't she want to feel, to glimpse, to know? To help find the answers to these questions, Tandeka began a series of workshops and conversations with Euro-Americans around the country, where she would encourage them to reflect upon their earliest memories of forming a racial identity. She gathered responses from people across a broad spectrum of ages, class backgrounds, and religious affiliations. And yet their stories had some striking similarities. Almost all of the stories were about children and adults who had learned how to think of themselves as white in order to stay out of trouble with their caretakers, or in the good graces of their peers, or the enforcers of community racial standards. Even when these individuals had engaged in or complied with behavior most of us would describe as racist, Tandeka says, their motive was not to attack someone outside their own racial community. They simply wanted to remain within their own community, or at least not be abandoned by it. They achieved their wish, but at a price. The quiet breakup of their core sense of themselves as different from their own community's racial ideals. So quiet that no one noticed that the wholehearted presence of the child or the adult was gone. There was the story of Frank, who remembered putting a coin in his mouth when he was 5, only to have his mother reprimand him because, quote, niggers keep them in their underwear, end quote. He knew that he would have to be more careful about what he did in the future. There was the story of Jack, who invited some black friends into his yard only to realize by his parents' discomfort that he had done something wrong. There was the story of Mike, who after walking past a white woman and black man walking hand in hand, heard his father and uncle make a series of negative statements about the kind of woman she must be. There was the story of Jackie, who had spoken so highly of one of her teachers that her parents encouraged her to invite him over for dinner. When her mother opened the door and discovered that the teacher was black, she was obviously flushed. When the teacher left, her parents were outraged that she had embarrassed them. There was the story of Sally, whose parents were strong civil rights supporters who preached racial equality, but who prevented her from going out with a high school friend because he was black. There was the story of Jay, whose parents took him on a car tour of the black area of the city when he was 4. His parents knew he had never seen black people before and did not want him to embarrass the family by staring at them when the family went to New York on vacation the following month. Tandeka writes, after listening to hundreds of Euro-Americans recount their early recollections of experiences that not only made them think of themselves as white, but also taught them to act in ways that would keep them within this racial pale, I began to doubt the validity of other Euro-Americans' initial claims that there were no such childhood incidents in their own lives. Rather, she said, I began to suspect that many of them had simply forgotten the incidents. Now, I know that as I have reflected on my own life as a Euro-American, I have not forgotten the moment when I learned that I was white. It was 1974. I was 7. My family had moved from Akron, Ohio to Wilson, North Carolina, a small town on the coastal plains, so that my father could accept a promotion. The move brought not only some significant changes in scenery and climate, but also significant changes in my understanding of the world. In Akron, I could walk to my elementary school, a school where all of the students, teachers, and employees were basically middle class and white. In Wilson, where the schools had been recently desegregated, I rode a bus to a school several miles from my home. Every weekday morning, I would travel from what I now know was the white middle-class neighborhood of my family to the literally dirt road sections of town where the residents were black. All of the regular passengers on this school bus were white, except for one. Before leaving what was considered to be the white part of town, you see, the bus would make a detour down Tarboro Road to a dilapidated old farmhouse that stood alone. Waiting outside this house would be a black 4th-grade girl. When she would enter the bus each morning, she would usually be greeted with silence, and once she sat down by herself near the back of the bus, she would be left alone. The morning that there were no empty seats for this girl was a morning I will never forget. It was the morning I now know I fully became white. I can still remember the panicked look in the girl's eyes as she scanned the bus for an empty seat. There were a number of seats that held only one child, but none that were fully empty. As she slowly made her way down the aisle, I could see her steel herself against what she must have known from experience would come next. She turned to ask a girl if she could sit with her, and the girl loudly responded, "This seat is taken." Several children laughed. Everyone knew that it wasn't taken. After all, there would be no other children picked up that morning. She went to the next available seat and did not bother to ask if she could sit. She just did. The boy already there had not left her more than an inch or so she just plopped herself down on top of him. It was a courageous act of defiance and self-determination. The boy quickly moved so as not to be touched by his new seatmate, and proceeded to engage in a performance of theatrics that rivaled any I had ever seen. He writhed against the wall of the bus, shouting out as though he had just been infected with deadly poison. This boy, obviously relishing the opportunity to humiliate the girl, then literally crawled over the back of the seat, screaming expletives and racial epithets. As I recall, the bus exploded with laughter at this young comedian's abusive routine. The scene seemed to be one of the most entertaining things some of the children had ever seen. I remember looking toward the front of the bus into the rearview mirror so that I could scan the eyes of the driver. Of course he would put a stop to this, but he didn't. He just kept driving. I remained in my seat, terrified, 7-year-old Mark, wondering what this girl must have been feeling, wondering why no one was stopping this, why no one was speaking up. Here was a bus filled with children who were mostly older than me, and an adult driver, and no one was defending this girl. I was ashamed and humiliated and silent. But who could blame me? I didn't have a model for speaking up. I'd never been in a situation like this before. Now the models that were presented to me were compliance or silence. I couldn't join my peers who were laughing at what was happening, but I knew that if I spoke up, I would be ostracized, just like this girl. My own survival took precedence. My own need to remain in my community, as I understood it at the time, demanded that I not respond. I did not share this story with anyone until I was an adult. It was too embarrassing to share, even for a 7-year-old. Tandeka would no doubt recognize my predicament, describing my experience on that bus as my initiation into the perversive complex of emotions she has labeled as white shame. Shame because it is a story that involves the discovery of an unresolved conflict that, when discovered, makes the speaker feel flawed. White shame because of the racial context in which the internal conflict is rooted. Tandeka contends that a person feels shame due to negative self-exposure. The self is exposed to someone it is not supposed to be, feeling what it is not supposed to feel. Tandeka's observations led her to believe that, in her words, the Euro-American child is a racial victim of its own white community, of parents, caretakers, and peers who attack it because it does not yet have a white racial identity. Rather than continue to suffer such attacks, the Euro-American child defends itself by creating a white racial identity for itself. It begins to think and act like its community's ideals of a white self. When the adult recalls the feeling and ideas it had to set aside in order to mount this defense, it feels shame. So often in our modern day work to dismantle racism, Tandeka implies, there is no acknowledgement of the ways in which the Euro-American child learns to think of itself as white, and that she does so to protect herself against racial abuse from her own community. The hope for Euro-Americans then, and in turn everyone else, is not just that we can be civil across interracial lines, but civil within our own racial communities, and even more importantly, civil to ourselves. At the root of all behavior currently labeled as racist is an absence of attention to the emotional abuse that makes it difficult for someone to relate wholeheartedly to another. If we continue to discount the self-inflicted wounds of Euro-Americans, the shame that has been directly and indirectly passed from adults to children for generations, it stands to reason we will never be able to remove our society from the clutches of skin-deep approaches to justice. We will keep fighting vigorously and righteously against cruelty in the world while dangerously ignoring the cruelty that we carry within ourselves. The cruelty we carry within ourselves. Anti-racism educator Shelley Tuckluck writes of how white people seek to avoid our shame and other confusing feelings by disconnecting from aspects of ourselves. She writes, "What we know becomes exiled, and over time that information becomes unavailable as we move through life and limits our ability to create and maintain emotional connections with others, especially those we may see as different." She asks, "If I, as a white person, am not fully seen, why should I see you? If my injury and perception does not receive attention, why should yours? If I have shut myself off from my own pain, shouldn't you do the same?" Once we split off from the aspects of our lives that bring us pain, we disown and reject them, casting them into the shadows of our own psyche. So, where do we go from here? Tandeka suggests that we know in our hearts. She suggests what we know in our hearts to be true. We need a new beginning where loyalties need no longer be skin deep, where our broken humanity can be healed, where difference will be affirmed as the grace of human engagement, and where the term person of color will finally refer to every human being. For we are all persons of color. We are all persons of color. In the years since I first read Tandeka's book and began considering her perspectives, I believe I have seen the influence of white disconnection and shame in much of the defensive responses to demands for racial justice. For example, I think that white shame may be at the core of the calls for our nation to be colorblind. As Robert Terry, an early researcher of white identity, has put it, being white means not having to think about it. And I think that's what insistence that we be colorblind is all about. As anti-racism writer and teacher Joseph Barnt has written, although a person advocating colorblindness may have good intentions, not seeing the color of a person of color is a way of making the person invisible. It also prevents us from seeing that society is still structured in ways that are detrimental to some people. Not noticing a person's color may have the intention of correcting inequality, but it has the opposite effect of helping to cover it up. But just seeing the differences in so-called people of color is not enough. We who think of ourselves as white need to see our own color too. We need to grapple with the realities of our own lives and backgrounds and privileges, not with shame, but with courageous curiosity. Courageous curiosity, the kind of curiosity a colleague of mine recently described in a Facebook post. He wrote, "I have been thinking about a sermon titled Popping the Bubble that would be nothing but vignettes of times my privilege as a straight perceived white man is so obvious it gets past my filters. Like the friend of color who could not drive to the meeting place I suggested because it would not be safe for them there, and that popped me out of my bubble. Or when I noticed all the annoying cars that were driving the speed limit on the highway were driven by people of color, and that popped me out of my bubble. Or when I affirmed a point in a meeting that my female colleague had made a few minutes before, and only then did our boss seem to hear it." And I could go on because the list is endless once you start seeing it. And that would be the message of this sermon. The more you pop the bubble of privilege, the more permeable it gets. One day he said, "I will get to preach that sermon, in part because of my privilege." Now I know that some of us may be uncomfortable when the topic of white privilege comes up. For some of us may have come from socioeconomic backgrounds that have been experienced as anything but privileged. In response to these concerns, I invite us to consider that notions of privilege are always relative. It all depends on what you are comparing. And I think we can agree that when reviewing the evidence of the past 500 years on this continent, to be perceived as white has brought advantages not accessible to many people of color, advantages that in countless ways continue today. And so my questions for us to consider, to take away with us today are, can we, as a predominantly white congregation, explore together what whiteness means for us with more courage and curiosity than defensiveness and dismissal? Can we begin to have the vulnerable conversations where we explore how we, each of us, has been racialized, each in our way, and compassionately consider the shame and relative stuckness that this racialization has brought? And can we be less concerned with how diverse our congregation is and more concerned with how we can better understand and dismantle the systems of racism that negatively impact every one of us? The road we need to travel stretches out before us, the road blazed by all the innocent children not yet hindered by cultural and or self-inflicted shame, the road that leads to our shared worth and dignity, the road that leads to our salvation as a diverse but interconnected human family. Yes, we are all persons of color, and this road stretches out before us. We only need the courage to walk down it together. May it be so.